The world after battle does not roar, it whispers. The silence that follows is not peace, but something heavier, something that presses down on the chest and makes every breath feel stolen. The soldier knew this silence well. He had lived through too many nights like this, nights when the cries of men and horses faded into the cold stillness of death. He walked slowly, his boots sinking into the churned soil. Smoke still curled up from the blackened earth, carrying the acrid sting of gunpowder. The once green field was now a scarred wasteland, littered with shattered wagons, broken rifles, and the still forms of men who had stood tall only hours before. The stench of iron and blood hung in the air, clinging to his skin, his clothes, his very soul. Each step felt like trespassing upon sacred ground. He paused often, not because he was weary, though he was, but because he feared what his eyes might fall upon next. The battlefield, in its cruel honesty, did not hide the truth. Here lay a comrade with his eyes still open, staring up at a sky he would never again see change. There, a horse struggled on its side, ribs heaving, its soft whinny more human than animal. With a swift hand, the soldier ended the creature's pain. His heart felt heavier with every mercy he gave. The soldier's name had once been called with pride. He had worn his uniform like armor, believing in cause and country. But wars had a way of stripping away belief, tearing away the layers until only a man remained, lonely, tired, and full of ghosts. Tonight, he was not a hero. He was simply a survivor, wandering through the wreckage, searching for something. He wasn't sure what. He told himself he was looking for life, a survivor, someone to bring back. But deep down, he knew he was also looking for meaning, for a reason to still draw breath when so many better men had not. The moon broke free from a veil of clouds, casting a pale silver glow across the ruined land. In that light, the broken bayonets glimmered like teeth, and the pools of blood shimmered like dark mirrors. He shivered despite the warmth of his coat. Silence stretched on, so absolute it made his ears ring. No cries for help, no groans, no rustling of movement. Just silence, broken only by the crunch of his boots and the distant crackle of dying fires. Then he froze. Somewhere, faint and fragile, a sound drifted across the field. It wasn't the moan of the dying, nor the groan of shifting timber. It was softer, higher, almost like a whisper. He turned sharply, his hand tightening around the rifle slung at his side. His eyes swept the darkness, scanning the burned-out husks of cabins that bordered the battlefield. There it was again, a voice, thin as a thread carried by the night air. A voice not of a soldier, but of a woman. The soldier's pulse quickened. He had seen what became of women caught in the path of war, and the thought chilled him more than the cold wind. For a moment he hesitated. To follow the sound was to invite another wound upon his already battered heart. He had seen too much suffering, too much cruelty. Did he have the strength to face more? But the whisper came again, trembling, barely, alive. He could not turn away. He shifted his rifle, steadied his breath, and began moving toward the ruined cabin from which the sound seemed to come. Each step grew heavier, yet faster, his senses sharpening. The battlefield behind him faded into shadows. Ahead lay something unknown, something that would change the course of his night, and perhaps the course of his very soul. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. The soldier's boots crunched softly against the frozen soil as he neared. The charred remains of the cabin. The once sturdy timbers now leaned inward, blackened and cracked, as though the house itself had suffered wounds too deep to heal. Smoke still lingered in the air, faintly glowing with embers that had not yet surrendered to the night. The place looked dead, but the soldier's ears clung to that fragile sound he had heard, the whisper of a voice. He stopped a few paces away, crouching low, listening. The battlefield had taught him caution. Enemies sometimes used the cries of the wounded to draw survivors into traps. But this was no soldier's cry. It was softer, trembling, almost too weak to belong to someone still alive. Please. The word was no louder than the rustle of a leaf, but it carried to him all. The same. His breath caught in his throat, a woman's voice, cracked with pain. He pressed his shoulder against the warped cabin wall and eased forward, careful not to let loose wood snap beneath his boots. Peering through a break in the timber, his eyes adjusted to the dim light inside. The cabin was wrecked, its roof half collapsed, the floor strewn with ash and splintered furniture. In the corner, half hidden beneath a tattered quilt, a figure trembled. She was curled into herself, knees drawn tight, her frame so thin she seemed more shadow than flesh. Her hair, once long and black, was tangled and matted with dirt. Her clothes were torn, barely clinging to her, more rags than garments. But it was her eyes that struck him most, wide, hollow, and glistening in the faint firelight. They darted toward him with the wildness of someone who had lived through a nightmare too long. "Stay back," she rasped, her voice breaking. Her hand moved as if to defend herself, but there was no weapon there, only trembling fingers clutching. The quilt closer. The soldier lifted one hand, palm open, his voice low and steady. "I won't hurt you," he said, though the words felt small, powerless against the weight of her fear. She coughed, her body racked with weakness, and tried to push herself further into the corner. "No. Please. Don't let them." Her words trailed off into silence, but the tremor in her tone spoke volumes. He stepped inside carefully, the floor groaning beneath his weight. The smell was stronger here, the mingled stench of smoke, sweat, and blood. His eyes swept the room, looking for threats, but there was only ruin. He moved closer, each step deliberate, until he could see her more clearly. Her skin was pale beneath. The dirt! Lips cracked from thirst, her frame trembling with exhaustion. But it was the look in her eyes that cut deepest. A plea for release, not rescue. "Just kill me fast," she whispered, barely audible. The soldier froze. The words struck him harder than any bullet could. He had heard men beg for death on the battlefield. But this was different. This was not the cry of a soldier too broken to fight on. This was the plea of someone whose spirit had been wounded in ways he could not yet understand. His throat tightened. He wanted to tell her no, that he would not, could not. But his voice would not come. Instead, he slowly lowered his rifle and set it aside, kneeling so that his gaze was level with hers. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly, though even as the words left his lips, he wondered if they were a lie. He had no right to promise her safety in a world so cruel. Her eyes glistened with tears, her lips trembling as she whispered again, "Please, don't let them find me." The soldier's jaw clenched. Whoever they were, they had left her in this state, broken, terrified, begging for death. His heart, already heavy with the weight of war, felt as though it cracked beneath the burden of her suffering. He reached out slowly, not to touch, but to show her his empty hand. "I'll help you," he said. "You don't need to die here." For the first time, her eyes softened. Not with trust, not yet, but with the faintest flicker of hope, or perhaps disbelief. Outside, the night wind howled against the broken timbers. Inside, the silence was no longer empty. It was the fragile pause, before a truth was revealed, one that would break him more than the war ever had. The soldier knelt in the wreckage, the faint glow of dying embers painting his face in shadows. The woman before him was little more than a ghost wrapped in torn fabric, her eyes hollow yet piercing, carrying more sorrow than he thought one human heart could hold. He had expected pain, perhaps injury. He had not expected a plea for death. Her voice came again, trembling like the last leaf clinging to a winter branch. "Kill me. Fast!" The words were not a scream, not even a demand. They were a surrender, an exhausted whisper born of despair too deep to carry any longer. He had heard men cry those words when their guts spilled on battlefields, when fire consumed them, when they were moments from death. But this woman was alive, barely breathing, yes, but alive. Her body was wounded, yet her spirit seemed more broken still. The soldier's chest tightened. His hand hovered above his knee, fingers curling into a fist. He could not do it. He would not. "No," he said firmly, though his voice cracked with the weight of it. "I won't take your life." Her gaze snapped to his, her lips parting as though the denial itself was cruelty. "You don't understand," she whispered, desperation sharp as a knife. "If they find me, if they come back..." She shook her head violently, tears streaking down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Death is kinder." The soldier swallowed hard. He had seen what war did to men, how it hollowed them out, chewed their souls until nothing but fear or rage remained. But to hear a woman, frail, battered, ask for death because life had been twisted into torment, that was something his heart was not prepared for. "Tell me who," he said, his voice low, steady but burning with a suppressed fire. "Who did this to you?" She flinched at the question, her whole body tightening as though even remembering would tear her apart. Her hands gripped the quilt tighter, pulling it over her chest. "Don't make me say it," she whispered. "Don't make me!" The soldier's jaw clenched. He didn't press her, not yet. He reached for his canteen, unscrewing the cap, and extended it toward her. "Drink," he urged gently. She stared at it as though it were a weapon, then back at him. Hesitation danced in her eyes, but thirst was a force stronger than mistrust. With shaking fingers, she took the canteen, lifting it weakly to her lips. The water spilled as much as it entered her mouth, but even so, she drank desperately until she coughed, pulling it away. The soldier steadied her trembling hand, then retrieved the canteen. For a moment, their eyes met again. Hers were softer. Now, though, the terror still lurked beneath. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you just do it? End it?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Because you don't deserve to die," he said simply. Her lip trembled. She turned her face away, staring into the ashes of the ruined cabin fire. "You don't know what they've done to me," she murmured, so softly he almost missed it. Heavy silence followed, broken only by the pop of a dying ember. The soldier's heart pounded. He wanted to reach out, to comfort. But he knew too sudden a gesture might break the fragile thread of trust forming between them. "Then let me know," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Tell me what they've done, and I'll carry it. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Her eyes glistened with tears as she slowly turned back to him. Her lips parted, and for the first time, her guard began to falter. Her plea was no longer for death, but for release, for someone to understand the weight she bore. And so, trembling in the half-light, she began to speak. The soldier leaned closer, careful to keep his movements slow, his presence steady. The cabin around them seemed to shrink into silence as if the world itself was waiting for her words. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, fixed on him yet also far away, like she was staring into a memory that refused to release her. "They came at night," she whispered, her voice thin as the wind slipping through broken boards. "The cabin, my family, we thought we were safe. But they..." Her breath caught, and she pressed her trembling hands to her face. Her shoulders shook, the quilt sliding down and exposing the bruises along her arms. The soldier's fists tightened until his nails bit into his palms. He had heard this story before from different lips in different places. He hated how familiar it sounded, how predictable cruelty could be, and yet every word still pierced him as though he were hearing it for the first time. They dragged me outside. Her voice cracked, each word costing her strength. I begged them to kill me instead of... She stopped, her throat working as if swallowing the rest of the sentence would bury the shame forever. But they only laughed. Her eyes, those wide, haunted eyes, locked onto his. In them, he saw not just pain, but a hollow space, as if part of her soul had been carved away. It wasn't just what they had done to her body. It was what they had branded into her spirit. The soldier forced his voice to remain calm, though it quivered with suppressed rage. You don't have to. Say more, he murmured. I know enough. But she shook her head fiercely. No, you don't. Her voice was sharp, desperate. You don't understand. They wanted me marked. To carry it forever. Her hands lowered, trembling as she clutched the edge of the quilt. The soldier realized what she meant before. She even moved, but he still wasn't prepared for it when she shifted the fabric aside. He saw it, burned deep into her skin. A brand. His breath caught, and his heart twisted painfully in his chest. The mark was cruel, deliberate, seared into her flesh like a farmer would mark cattle. The edges were raw, blistered, still angry from the fire that had pressed it into her. It wasn't just an injury, it was a declaration. A symbol that said she no longer belonged to herself. Her eyes searched his face, wide and trembling. She was waiting, for disgust, for pity, for rejection. For him to turn away like others had, or to grant her the death she had begged for. But the soldier did not look away. He forced himself to hold her gaze, even though every part of him burned with fury at what had been done. His throat tightened as he whispered, They don't own you. Not now. Not ever. Her lips parted, quivering, her breath catching on a sob she tried to swallow. A tear slid down her cheek, leaving a pale streak through the soot. You lie, she said weakly, though her voice trembled with doubt rather than certainty. This, Mark, it doesn't wash away. I'll always carry it. I'll never be free. The soldier shook his head, his voice low and fierce. You're alive. That's freedom they couldn't take. As long as you breathe, you're more than what they tried to make of you. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. The soldier's heart pounded. He feared he had said too much, too boldly. But then in her eyes, those haunted eyes, he caught the faintest flicker. Not trust, not yet, but something like defiance. Something like the faint ember of a soul that wanted to live, even after all it had suffered. The soldier exhaled slowly, his chest aching. He knew then that his battle was no longer with muskets and sabers. It was with the darkness that lingered, inside her, planted by those who had tried to break her, and it was a battle he swore he would not lose. The soldier stayed kneeling before her, the ruined cabin crackling faintly around them as if the fire that had consumed it still whispered in the air. Her eyes lingered on him, still wary, still haunted. The brand on her flesh seemed to glow in his mind, even though the embers had long died. He wanted nothing more than to cover it again, to shield her from the weight of it. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the small leather pouch at his side. His fingers brushed over its worn strap. The same pouch he had carried through countless battles. Inside were rags, salves, and a handful of herbs. A meager soldier's medicine kit. It wasn't much, but it had kept him alive through wounds that should have ended him. I need to treat it, he said softly. His voice was calm, but inside he felt the storm raging. The burn. If I leave it, it'll rot. Infection will spread. At once she flinched, clutching the quilt tighter against her body. No! The word cracked in the still air, sharp as glass. Don't touch me. The soldier froze, his hand hovering over the pouch. Her eyes had widened, breath coming fast and shallow, her entire body shrinking away from him as if his very shadow might burn her. He pulled his hand back immediately, palms open, showing her he meant no harm. I won't, not unless you allow me, he said quickly, his tone firm but gentle. I swear it. For a long moment, only the sound of her ragged breathing filled the cabin. Her hands shook where they clutched the quilt, knuckles pale, but her eyes studied him, searching, measuring. They all said that, she whispered bitterly, her voice broken but sharp. Every one of them. We won't hurt you. And then... Her voice cracked, her gaze falling away, drowning in memory. Then they laughed. The soldier's chest tightened like a vice. He wanted to curse the monsters who had scarred her. He wanted to hunt them down and make them bleed. But right now, vengeance could wait. Right now, only her pain mattered. You're right to be afraid, he admitted softly, his voice low, raw. Men have given you no reason to trust, but I am not them. I'm just a man who doesn't want to see you suffer more than you already have. Her eyes flicked back to him, uncertain, caught between distrust and the faintest glimmer of need. She bit her lip, trembling. Why? She asked. Why do you care? You don't even know me. He hesitated, then spoke the truth that had weighed on him for years. Because I've seen too much death, too much cruelty. I can't walk away, not from you, not when I can help. The words hung in the air, and for the first time her grip on the quilt loosened. Only a little, but enough. She looked down at her arm, at the burns and cuts, then back at him. Her lips parted, trembling, as if she wanted to say yes, but didn't know how. Finally, her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, and she whispered, If you must, but please be gentle. The soldier nodded once, solemnly, as though she had just entrusted him with the weight of her very soul. He reached for the pouch again, slower this time, every movement deliberate. He drew out a strip of cloth, a small flask of water, and a jar of ointment. His hands were steady, though his heart thundered. When he reached toward her, he did not touch her skin immediately. Instead, he let the back of his hand rest against the quilt, letting her see, letting her decide. Her eyes narrowed, watching him closely. Then, after a long moment, she released the fabric just enough for him to see her wounds. He worked silently, cleaning the edges of the burn, dabbing water to wash away the dirt, applying the cool salve that eased the angry heat. She flinched, at first her body trembling under his hand, but he spoke softly as he worked, his words calm, like a lullaby. You're safe now, he murmured, though his own heart questioned the truth of it. At last, when the wound was dressed and wrapped in fresh cloth, he sat back on his heels. Her breathing had steadied, her body still tense but less rigid. She clutched the quilt again, covering herself, her eyes fixed on him. Not trust, not yet. But no longer terror either. It was a beginning. The soldier sat back on his heels, his hands still faintly trembling despite years of battle hardening them. He had dressed wounds before, bullet tears, saber cuts, burns from cannon fire, but none had left him with such a hollow ache in his chest. This wasn't just about healing flesh. Every stroke of the cloth, every layer of salve had been like brushing against her memories, against the invisible scars burned into her soul. She sat huddled in silence, the quilt pulled tightly to her chin once more. Her breathing had steadied, though her eyes still darted toward him with caution, like a bird ready to flee at the first sign of danger. He could have left it there, treated the burn, given her water, and walked away. But something gnawed at him, Something unfinished, that brand, that cruel mark. He couldn't stop thinking about it. What he had glimpsed was only part of the truth, and he knew it. "You said they wanted you marked," he murmured at last, his voice low, careful not to push too hard. Was it only that? Her eyes dropped to the floor, her fingers tightening around the quilt until her knuckles turned white. She didn't answer. The soldier waited. He had learned in war that silence often spoke louder than words. The way she shook her head, the way her lips pressed tight, it was enough. There was more. Far more. Finally, her whisper slipped into the still air. Not just one mark. He frowned, his jaw tightening. Where else? For a long time, she didn't move. He thought she might retreat entirely, shut down, refuse to speak again. But then, with a trembling hand, she pulled the quilt lower, slowly, hesitantly, as though unveiling a secret that would destroy her if he looked too long. And then he saw her thighs, her hips, her ribs. Burns, cuts, brands. Not just one cruel insignia, but several seared deep into her skin in jagged patterns. Each one deliberate, each one a proclamation of ownership, like cattle branded by different masters, traded, passed around. The soldier's breath caught, and for a moment he thought he might be sick. His hands curled into fists at his knees, nails digging into flesh. Rage burned through him, so hot it threatened to choke him. He had seen men killed in the cruelties of war, but this was beyond the battlefield. This was evil carved into flesh and bone. Her voice came, faint and shaking. They passed me between them. Each one wanted me marked as theirs. They laughed while the iron burned. Said I belonged to them forever. Said no man would look at me without seeing their claim. Her words cracked, her tears flowing freely now. I begged for death, but they wouldn't give it. They wanted me to live. So every time I looked at myself, I'd remember. The soldier's vision blurred with fury. He wanted to storm from the cabin, hunt every one of those men, and carve justice into them with steel. But he forced himself still, forced himself to breathe. Right now wasn't about vengeance. It was about her. She looked at him then, eyes wide and glistening, bracing for the disgust she expected to see. "Now you know," she whispered. "Now you see why I asked you to end it. No one can erase this. No one." The soldier leaned forward, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of a vow. "Listen to me. They scarred your body, yes, but they don't own you. Not now. Not ever. Their marks mean nothing compared to the strength that kept you alive." Her lips quivered, her breath hitching on a sob. She shook her head weakly. "You don't believe that." But he did. And in that moment he knew. His war was no longer with soldiers on a battlefield. It was with the chains of shame they had shackled her with. And he would fight this war, not with bullets or blades, but with every word, every gesture, every promise that could help her believe she was more than what they had branded her to be. The soldier remained kneeling in the ruined cabin, his breath steady but his heart raging like a storm. His eyes had seen too much that night, too much pain written in fire upon her skin. The brands were not random burns, not crude scars left by chance. They were deliberate, precise, carved by cruel hands with intention. His gaze lingered on the jagged symbols, and the truth slowly formed like a blade being drawn from its sheath. He had seen marks like these before, burned into wood, carved into trees, stitched onto banners carried by raiders. They were not just brands, they were emblems. Each one belonged to a different band of mercenaries. Outlaws who lived on the fringes of war, preying on the weak when armies moved on, carving their insignia into everything they touched. He had seen their signs on burned villages, on stolen wagons, even scrawled on corpses left to rot as warnings. But never had he seen so many etched into a single body. The soldier's stomach turned. They hadn't just used her. They had fought over her, like jackals over carrion, each staking their claim with fire. To them, she was not a woman. She was a trophy, a canvas for their cruelty, a reminder that their laughter meant more than her. Screams. Her voice pulled him from his fury. It was faint, broken, but steady enough to slice through the silence. "You recognize them, don't you?" His eyes shot to hers. She had seen the flicker in his expression, the tightening of his jaw. "Yes," he admitted, his tone like gravel. "I've seen these marks before, on their banners, on the land they've destroyed, but never like this." Her lips trembled, tears clinging to her lashes. "Then you know, there's no hope for me. Every time someone sees me, they'll know what I was, who I belonged to." Her voice cracked as she clutched the quilt against her chest. "Even if I ran, even if I hid, their brands will follow me forever." The soldier's fists curled tighter. He hated how she said belonged, as if her very spirit had been stolen from her. He leaned closer, his voice deep and fierce. "No, you don't belong to them. You never did. Those marks are theirs, not yours. They carved their cruelty into your skin, but it doesn't define you." She looked at him with wide, hollow eyes. "You don't mean that. You're only saying what sounds kind." He shook his head. "I've buried too many lies on battlefields to waste my breath on another. I mean every word." Her tears slipped, free, trailing down her dirt-streaked cheeks. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy with fear. It was fragile, uncertain, carrying the faintest possibility of belief. The soldier studied the brands once more, anger searing through his chest. Each symbol was a memory of the monsters who had done this. Each mark a promise he swore he would break. He would not let their laughter echo forever through her skin. "I know these men," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the fire inside him. "And I know where they crawl when they think the world isn't watching. If I live long enough, I'll find them. Every one of them." Her eyes widened at his words, a flicker of something shifting deep within them. Fear. Yes. But also something else, something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. "Hope," she whispered, barely audible. "And if they come back for me?" The soldier's gaze did not waver. He straightened his back, the firelight catching on the steel, in his eyes. "Then they'll find me waiting." The cabin had fallen silent again, but not the kind of silence that suffocated. This one lingered heavy with unspoken truths, with the weight of a story too cruel to belong to one person. The soldier sat motionless, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the broken woman before him. Every detail of her wounds, every brand scorched into her flesh, carved itself into his memory as though his soul itself were being branded. His chest ached, not from exhaustion, not from hunger or wounds of his own, but from something deeper. It was the kind of ache that no medicine could cure. The kind that came when a man's heart saw more pain than it was built to bear. He had walked through countless battlefields. He had stepped over friends and foes alike, had watched strong men bleed out with curses on their lips. He had endured nights where the stars seemed to mock the dead below. He thought he had grown numb to sorrow. But now, looking at her, he realized he had only been spared this kind of grief until tonight. Her eyes haunted him most, wide, empty, yet brimming with a sorrow that seemed endless. They were the eyes of someone who had not only suffered but had been taught to believe that suffering was all she deserved. He hated it. He hated that she believed death was the only freedom left to her. He swallowed hard, lowering his gaze to the floorboards cracked beneath them. A part of him wanted to weep, but soldiers did not weep. not where others could see. Still, the pressure behind his eyes burned, and his throat felt thick with words he couldn't say. He wondered how many more like her lay scattered across the war-torn land, abandoned in cabins, barns, and fields. Forgotten by the armies that marched on, their suffering drowned out by the clash of steel and thunder of cannons. The thought nearly broke him. "Why do you look at me like that?" Her voice trembled suddenly, pulling him back from the spiral of his thoughts. He blinked, raising his eyes to hers. She had pulled the quilt tighter around herself, as though trying to shield not her body but her spirit from his gaze. "Like I'm still human," she whispered. "Like I'm not ruined." The soldier's chest clenched. He leaned forward, his voice rough with emotion he could not hide. "Because you are human, more human than the beasts who did this to you. They tried to strip it away, but they failed. You're still here, still breathing, still fighting, even if you don't see it." Her lips trembled, her eyes shining with tears. "Fighting? I begged you to kill me." He shook his head. "No, you begged because you thought there was no hope left. But you're still here, speaking, breathing. That is fighting, whether you believe it or not." The tears finally spilled, rolling down her cheeks. She turned her face away, ashamed to let him see, but her sobs broke through the quiet anyway. The sound tore at him, sharper than any blade. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to promise her that the world could still be kind. But he didn't, not yet. She was too fragile, too raw. Even comfort could wound her now, so instead he sat with her tears. He let them fall. Let the silence carry them. Let her grief have space to live. Inside, his heart was breaking. Breaking not only for her, but for every cruelty he had seen and had not stopped. Breaking because in this ruined cabin, with this broken woman, he finally saw the truth he had spent years trying to avoid. War did not end when the fighting stopped. It lingered in scars, in brands, in haunted eyes that would never unsee what had been done. And he swore to himself, quietly, fiercely, that, if nothing else, he would not let her suffer alone. The soldier sat in the ashes of the ruined cabin, watching the woman's shoulders tremble beneath the tattered quilt. Her sobs had quieted to soft, uneven breaths. The kind that came after grief had wrung every drop of strength from the body. She looked smaller now, fragile as glass, but in her very survival, he saw a strength greater than most men carried into battle. He wanted to tell her that. He wanted to speak 1,000 words of comfort. But words, he knew, were cheap. The men who had scarred her had used words, false promises, sweet lies, before breaking her with fire and laughter. No, she didn't need empty words. She needed something stronger, something unshakable. He shifted closer, slow enough not to startle her, until his voice could carry softly between them. "I can't erase what they did," he said, his tone low and steady, each word carved from his heart. "I can't take away those marks or the memories that burn you when you close your eyes. But I can promise you this. While I draw breath, they will not touch you again." Her eyes flicked to his, sharp and searching. She had heard promises before, no doubt. She had clung to them, only to have them shattered. But this time something in his tone, quiet, fierce, unyielding, made her pause. "You don't even know my name," she whispered, suspicion and sorrow tangled together. He nodded slowly. "No, I don't. But I don't need it to see that. You've suffered enough for 10 lifetimes. Names don't bind a man to a vow. Honor does." Her lips parted, trembling as though she wanted to believe but couldn't. "And when you leave?" she asked softly, bitterness flickering in her voice. "When the army calls you back? When you march away like all the others?" The soldier's jaw tightened. He had no answer for that. not an honest one. War demanded men come and go. It tore them from places where they were needed most. But he could not bear to see her sink deeper into despair. "I won't abandon you," he said finally, the words ringing like an oath spoken before the heavens themselves. "If the war drags me back, I'll see you safe first, even if I must carry you across the wasteland on my shoulders." Her eyes softened, just slightly, and she studied him as though trying to find the cracks in his vow. "You say that like it's easy." He shook his head. "Nothing worth keeping safe is easy. But I've carried men bleeding out from the field, dragged them through mud and fire because I wouldn't leave them behind. You think I'd leave you? Not while there's breath in me." Her tears welled again, but this time they didn't fall from despair. They shimmered, suspended between disbelief and something almost like hope. The soldier reached for her then, not to touch her skin, but to lay his calloused hand gently on the edge of the quilt. A gesture that asked, not demanded. A gesture of presence, not possession. "I can't promise you the world will suddenly be kind," he admitted. "But I can promise that while you walk beside me, no one will brand you, no one will break you, and no one will ever laugh at your pain again. That's my vow." For a long, fragile moment, silence filled the cabin. Her breathing steadied, her gaze fixed on his hand, on the steadiness in his eyes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. It wasn't trust, not fully, but it was the first step toward it, and as the soldier exhaled, he realized something. This vow was not only for her, it was for him too. For every friend he had lost, every village he had failed to protect, every nameless cry he had walked past because war demanded he move forward. This time, he would not walk away. The first rays of morning crept through the cracks in the ruined cabin, painting the floorboards with slivers of gold. Dust floated in the still air, glowing like tiny embers that refused to fade. The soldier had sat awake all night, watching over her as she drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, the fire burning low between them. When her eyes finally opened to the dim light, there was no scream, no sudden gasp of terror, only a weary blink, a glance toward him, hesitant, uncertain, but softer than before. She pulled the quilt tighter and whispered, "It's morning." He nodded. "It is, and you've lived to see it." For a heartbeat, she seemed confused, as though the simple truth of surviving another night felt foreign. But then her lips quivered with the smallest trace of something unfamiliar, something she had forgotten she could still feel. Relief. The soldier rose slowly, stretching stiff muscles, and glanced at the broken door. Beyond it, the forest stirred, with the song of waking birds, a world alive and unbroken by the horrors inside the cabin. He turned back to her. "We can't stay here," he said gently. "This place is only ash and ghosts. Out there," he nodded toward the light spilling in. "There's a path. A long one, maybe, but it leads away from this." Her eyes dropped to the brands hidden beneath the quilt. "But I carry it with me, no matter where I go." The soldier knelt before her, his voice steady. "Scars don't chain you. They remind you of what you survived. The chains are broken. You're free now." She studied him, as though weighing whether to believe, and then, with trembling fingers, she lowered the quilt just enough to reveal a single brand, its edges raw and ugly. Her voice was fragile, but there was strength buried beneath. "If I walk into the world like this, people will see me as theirs." He met her gaze without flinching. "Then let them see me standing beside you, and let them try." Her breath hitched. For the first time, she didn't look away. The silence between them was no longer filled with despair, but with something unspoken, something like a promise shared between two broken souls. At last she nodded. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, but when she stumbled, his arm was there, steady as iron. She leaned on him, not with shame, but with the first flicker of trust. Together they stepped toward the door. The soldier pushed it open, and the sunlight poured in, warm and unyielding. She winced at its brightness, raising a hand to shield her eyes, but then let it fall, letting the warmth touch her face. It wasn't freedom yet, not healing, not peace, but it was a beginning. As they stood in the doorway, the soldier spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. Every dawn is a choice. Today you chose to live. Tomorrow you'll choose again. And I'll be here, as long as you need me. Her lips parted, trembling, but no words came. Instead, she gave a single nod, a tear sliding down her cheek, not of despair, but of something new. Hope. And so they stepped out of the ruined cabin, two figures walking into the rising sun, one broken by cruelty, the other hardened by war, but together, carrying the fragile possibility of something greater than both had ever dared to believe.